All right, it's 7, so let's jump in. Thank you for everyone who is watching this talk. If you haven't been to one of our presentations before, my name's Caroline Hughes, and I'm the volunteer and outreach biologist at LPC. This is the second in our winter and spring nature talk series that's focusing on loons and the work of LPC in New Hampshire. So if you missed our first talk, that is available on our YouTube channel, and I hope you'll be able to watch that. Tonight, we are talking about lead fishing tackle and the impact that it's had on loons in New Hampshire. Just a couple notes about how this meeting is going to run. If you have a question, please put it in the YouTube chat. I will be monitoring the chat as Tiffany is giving her presentation and answering questions as they come up, if they can be answered in text. If it's a question that's better to be answered by Tiffany, then we'll wait till the end of her presentation and then she will be answering questions then. At our last presentation, we had a little bit of a problem with the YouTube chat. And so we'd appreciate it if folks could chime in there and let us know if you're able to access that feature. If you're not able to access it, I do have my phone on me and can check my email. And so if someone could send me an email at volunteers@loon.org, that would be great. If you have suggestions for topics that you'd like to see covered in a future presentation, again, please send me an email at volunteers@loon.org. And the same thing, if you have feedback for us, if you really enjoyed this presentation or if you think that there are things we could do better in the future, please send me an email. And then finally, our last presentation in this series, which will be taking place on May 20th, is going to be a Q&A session. And so if there are questions that come up for you about loons, if there are questions that we don't get to answer at our other talks in this series that you'd like an answer to, please save them up and you can either email them to me at volunteers@loon.org or you can just bring them live to that session and put them in the chat and we'll be glad to answer them. Before we jump in, I just want to give a little bit of background about LPC. So we are an organization that began our work in 1975 in response to a dramatic observed decline in New Hampshire's loon population. And our mission is to restore and maintain a healthy population of loons in New Hampshire, to monitor the health and productivity of our loon population, and to promote a greater understanding of loons and the larger natural world. We are a membership-based organization, and so if you're interested in supporting our work, you can go to loon.org/memberships. With that, I'm going to hand over the reins to Tiffany Grade, who is our presenter tonight. Tiffany is LPC's Squam Lakes biologist. She has been at LPC since 2008, and she did her master's thesis work on lead in New Hampshire's loon population. She later expanded upon that work and published a paper on this in the Journal of Wildlife Management. So I can't think of a better person to give this talk. And with that, Tiffany, you can take it over.
Great, thank you so much, Caroline. So let me just share my screen here. And can you see that, Caroline?
All right, and I think you are still on mute.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Caroline? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. All right, thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you to everyone for tuning in here. So as Caroline said, I'll be talking to you tonight about a really important issue facing New Hampshire's loon population, which is, of course, that of lead fishing tackle. But first, I'd just like to tell you, oops, the screen's not advancing here. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'd first like to tell you about my first encounter with a lead poisoned loon after I started working for Loon Preservation Committee. So this was a loon that was on Squam Lake back in 2010. And we were out for a routine night of banding. And this was a male loon, and he's pictured here. While we were banding, we had captured him, and he had a 2-week-old chick at the time. And everything was going perfectly routine with the banding. Everything seemed just fine. But of course, while we're banding the loons, you may be aware we take a small blood sample from each loon to run for various health tests. But one of the things that we test for is lead. So we took the blood sample from this loon, took it back to the lab, and the next morning, the results came back that this loon had toxic levels of lead in it. So over the course of the next week, we were out every night trying to recapture this loon if anything could possibly be done to save it. And that week isn't forever seared into my memory, being out there trying to get this loon. But of course, he had already been captured for banding and he was on to us. And we could not get close to him. So about a week, at the end of that week, we got a call one day that there was a loon that was attacking another loon, and it turned out that it was this male who was being attacked. Because of course, loons that may not have territories and are looking to take over another loon's territory, they will key in on the slightest bit of weakness in another loon. So the intruder had detected that this male was sick, attacked him, drove him up among the rocks along the shoreline. And at that point, we were able to pick him up and we took him to the vet. This is at Plymouth Animal Hospital, where an x-ray was taken of him. And the x-ray showed us exactly, unfortunately, what we expected to see, which was tackle inside of this loon's gizzard. And here you can see the jig head, which of course turned out to be lead, as well as the broken off fragment of the hook from that jig. And given that this loon had this tackle in its gizzard, and we already knew that a week ago he already had toxic levels of lead, sadly we had no choice but to euthanize that loon. And here you see the jig head and the hook fragment that was removed from this loon when the necropsy, which is simply an animal autopsy, was performed later. And so that's a week, and that's a situation that I will always remember. But sadly, this is only one loon in a long history of lead-poisoned loons. And in fact, the very first loon that was ever documented anywhere to have died of lead poisoning was found on Squam Lake and brought to LPC just a year after LPC's founding in 1976. It was found by a resident of Squam Lake who knew LPC's founder, Rawson Wood, who was also a resident of Squam Lake. Rawson took that loon and had it sent to the National Fish and Wildlife Health Diagnostic Lab in Madison, Wisconsin. And what you see here is actually the original necropsy report from that lead poison loon that's in LPC's files. And I just draw your attention to this part that I've highlighted in yellow here, diagnosis, lead poisoning, and the veterinarian writes, to my knowledge, lead poisoning in a common loon has not been previously reported. I will be publishing this case to further document the importance of lead in the environment. And this case was eventually published, and so LPC has a long history with lead poison loons, and in fact, was involved in the first ever documented case of lead poisoning in loons. So after that beginning, the person who really carried the ball forward on understanding just how serious an issue lead is for loons is Dr. Mark Pokrist, who you see pictured here from the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University. And Mark always likes to tell the story of his first lead poison loon, which was in 1986, when LPC's then executive director, Betsy McCoy, called him up one day and said, we have a dead loon, would you take a look at it and tell us what happened to it? And that was lead poisoning. And well, the rest was history, both for loons and for Dr. Pokrist's research. He has since necropsied literally thousands of loons over the years. And what we know about lead mortality, and in fact, any mortality in loons for that matter, in New England and beyond, is really grounded in Dr. Pokrist's work. And LPC's data on loons and lead is really standing on his shoulders. So what is that data? LPC really started sending our dead loons to Dr. Pokrist and Tufts, excuse me, beginning in 1989. And the data for causes of mortality for adult loons from that time, as you can see, is sadly dominated by lead fishing tackle. 42% of our documented adult cases are accounted for by lead, far more than any of the other causes that you see here. So first, before we really get into things, just a little tackle terminology. The two main things that we find inside of lead poison loons are sinkers and jigs. And so for those of you who aren't anglers out there, sinker is simply a weight that you put on the line to hold the line down. And a jig is basically a sinker with a hook attached to it. So this head part here is the part that would contain lead. A hook is attached to it, and then anglers can dress these up in various ways to make them attractive to the fish. So how do loons ingest lead tackle? So a typical prey item for a loon is a fish between roughly 4 to 8 inches. But loons will regularly ingest fish that are 12 inches or larger. And in fact, the largest fish that's been documented in the scientific literature being eaten by a loon is nearly 17 inches. So they can get some real monsters when they really put their minds to it. And these, of course, are fish that are very capable of breaking a fishing line. So a fish that's broken a line and has maybe swallowed some tackle or has some caught in its throat and maybe has some fishing line coming out of its mouth, that fish is not going to be swimming as well as the fish next to it. And so that's the fish that the loons will hone in on, and it's really easy pickings for them. And as you can see here, loons swallow their fish whole. So anything that may be inside or on that fish, once the loon swallowed it, that's going to go down into the loon as well. Loons will also strike at fish that are being reeled in by an angler. And if they get that fish, break that line, they'll get the tackle as well. And loons will even strike at baits that are being retrieved by anglers because, of course, loons' instinct is to strike at something that flashes past them. In their minds, and evolutionarily speaking, that would be a fish. They strike at it and instinct is to eat it, but of course it could well be fishing tackle. And if they grab onto that tackle, break that line, they'll get that tackle as well. And all these types of things, both the fish that's broken the line, a loon that's going after a fish being reeled in by an angler, or simply striking at an angler's bait, is what I refer to as current fishing activity. And LPC's data has suggested that this is the predominant way that loons ingest lead fishing tackle. It used to be thought that the main way that loons get tackle is by picking it up off the bottom. And certainly some loons do ingest tackle this way. So loons regularly ingest small pebbles, which seem to serve as grit. They hold them in the gizzard. And of course, because loons are swallowing their fish whole, they need to break down that food some way. And it seems like these pebbles are one way they do to help that. It's almost like they've like a bunch of little teeth basically down there in the gizzard to help grind up their food. But of course, if somebody's accidentally dropped a split shot sinker into the water and it sinks, a loon could easily mistake that for a pebble, pick it up and ingest it. And it used to be thought that this was the main way loons got lead tackle, and certainly some do, but it actually, the evidence suggests that this is a much more secondary way and accounts for a smaller minority of cases. Lead poisoning, of course, does primarily affect adult loons. And of course, the reason for this is that the fish that young loons are eating are simply not big enough to be fish that have broken a line, have tackle attached to it in one way or another. So lead poisoning really is primarily a condition that affects adult loons. So what is the evidence that suggests that adults are primarily acquiring their lead through current fishing activity? So there's a couple ways, and one line of evidence is what we find inside of these loons that have died of lead fishing tackle. So all of this tackle was removed from the digestive tract of a loon during a necropsy. This loon was from Bow Lake in 2007. And as you can see, loons will literally swallow hook, line, and sinker, as well as everything else. So what you see here is a leader with a tangle of fishing line on it. few wires associated with fishing gear, a couple spinners here. And then these two are the lead objects that came from this loon. This is a sinker, and this is a small jig. And of course, if a loon was simply picking up pebbles off the bottom as grit, they would not mistake all of this for a pebble. These have obviously no resemblance to the pebbles that loons would ingest. So it's hard to imagine any realistic way that a loon would ingest all of this without one of those methods I mentioned from current fishing activity. This is the X-ray from that loon. And here you see, here's the sinker, here's the jig that you saw in that picture, and the spinners down here as well as one of those wires. And here's another loon, this one from Fish Cove on Winnipesaukee in 1997. And in this case, you can see once again a hook with a tangle of fishing line still on it. Once again, we have the leader, the swivel, and a little strand of fishing tackle. And once again, here are the lead objects. This is a lead jig head, and here are two small lead split shot sinkers. Once again, the X-ray, the hook, leader, swivel, the jig head, and then one of those split shots is visible there. And so with the lead poison loons that we get, we find all this associated tackle. In other words, the leaders, the swivels, the fishing line, the hooks. We find this associated tackle in approximately 2/3 of the lead poison loons that we collect. The actual number could well be higher, as these objects tend to dissolve and break down more easily inside of the stomach of the loon, or they could be passed by the loon prior to collection. But all of these cases that we get with this associated tackle along with the lead object, these all suggest that the loon had acquired the lead and the tackle from current fishing activity rather than simply picking it up off the bottom. The other line of evidence to support this is the timing of these lead deaths. So this blue line here that you see on the graph, this is the number of loon mortalities from lead fishing tackle that we've collected in a given month. The red line here is a survey that I had done of fishing activity on Squam Lake. And you can see that both of these peak in July and August. Now, if the loons were simply getting the lead from a reservoir of lost tackle off of the lake bottom, we would expect a fairly steady line from approximately mid-April when the loons come back to the lake soon after ice out, all the way through October and into early November. But that's not what we see. We do see this peak that is coincident with peak fishing activity. So this does, once again, another line of evidence to suggest that loons are getting it from current fishing activity. And this finding is really important, that the loons are not getting it primarily from picking it off the bottom, because it means that if people would make the switch to non-lead tackle and stop using lead, we should see immediate benefits to the loon population. What this suggests is that loons are not condemned to years of high lead mortality for years to come from picking it up from this reservoir of tackle on the lake bottom. If people would make the switch to non-lead tackle, stop using lead, we should see a real decrease in lead mortalities right away. So this is actually really positive, hopeful, good news. So what does happen to a loon once they have picked up a piece of lead tackle? So of course they swallow it, it goes down into their gizzard, and the loon's gizzard is a very powerful muscular organ with a very strong acid inside of it. And once that lead gets down into that gizzard, the grinding action of the gizzard combined with that acid causes the lead to erode. And that's what you see happening here. So this bright object that you see here is the jig head that the loon had ingested, and then this bright plume coming off of it. That's the lead that's eroding from the jig and going into the loon's bloodstream. So it goes into the loon's bloodstream and then it goes into their brain. Symptoms of that loon's experience once they have gotten lead poisoning includes lethargy, anemia, loss of muscle coordination, drooping wings. They get green color diarrhea, as well as neurological symptoms as this lead is going into their brain, and it can result in convulsions and tremors. And it really is a terrible way for a loon or any other animal to die. And loons will die within 2 to 4 weeks of ingesting a piece of lead tackle. And by the time we get the call that there's a loon on the beach or acting strangely, that lead has already gone into that loon's brain. And so sadly, oftentimes when we pick these loons up, we have no choice but to euthanize them once we've established the fact that this loon has lead poisoning. Lead poisoned loons have only been successfully treated just a handful of times. And, thank goodness there's wonderful veterinarians and wildlife rehabilitators that are working to try to improve outcomes and try to help these loons. But it is a tough condition to deal with. And sadly, it is far too often a death sentence for these loons. And the cases that have been successfully treated for lead poisoning, these are cases where the loons were captured and able to be treated before their blood lead levels were very high. But sadly, far too many of the loons that we get are too far down that path as far as lead poisoning by the time we become aware of them. So a question that we get a lot from people are, what about the hooks? How do we know that it's the lead that's killing the loons rather than the hooks that they may ingest as well? And that's a really great question when we get it. And we're looking at an x-ray of a loon here from Level Lake in Wakefield in 2011. You can see the lead object here in the loon, as well as a couple of really nasty looking hooks in there. So here's a closer look at what you're seeing there in the x-ray. And these are these objects that were removed from the loon following the necropsy. Once again, the lead object, a piece of the hook with some of the fishing line still tangled around it, and then the other hook fragment. And the necropsy report for this loon had noted that one of these hook fragments was embedded in the wall of the loon's gizzard. And this is what we see with these loons. They have this ability to wall these things off, basically. So think about what the loons are eating. They're eating these fish that have spines, have sharp, pointy bones. Of course, perch are a favorite food for a loon. And for those of you who know perch, they have some really nasty spines coming off of that dorsal fin. So loons have evolved to deal with eating sharp, pointy objects, basically. And in fact, they've evolved a thickened wall of their esophagus and thickened walls of their gizzard to deal exactly with this. So in many ways, a hook is simply yet another spiny object for a loon. And so if one ends up embedding in the wall of the gizzard, basically almost like a scab will essentially form over it. And the loon's body has the ability to just wall it off. And usually it causes no further problems for that loon. And that's what happened with this loon. The necropsy report had noted that the hook was embedded, but causing no issues for the loon. Now, that's not to say it doesn't happen. Every once in a while, you get a loon where the hook does puncture and cause injury or infection. And if you look at the data here on our mortalities, you see this red box here, monofilament line and non-lead fishing tackle. Oops, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way here. And taking a closer look at these cases, only 9 of these are cases where the hook had in fact punctured the loon and caused an injury or infection that resulted in death. So 9 is a far cry from the 159. So it's not to say it doesn't happen. It does, but it's a pretty rare situation. So going back to this particular loon, this loon had lead liver levels that were at 12 parts per million, and 6 parts per million in the liver is considered fatal. So this loon had twice the lethal dose of lead in it. And this is really quite typical of what we see in these loons. The hooks may be floating around, maybe they'll embed in the esophagus or the gizzard, but they generally don't cause any problems because these loons are well evolved to deal with sharp, pointy objects. It's the lead that ends up getting them. So beyond the terrible individual suffering and death that these loons endure from lead, why is lead such a problem for loon populations? And it really goes back to loon life history. We always like to say loons aren't ducks. They have a very, very different life history from many birds. So one of them, really long lifespan. We don't know exactly how long loons live, but right now our best knowledge is between about 25 and 30 years. So they're a very long-lived bird. The only thing is we've only been banding loons for about 30 years. So as we get out from that 30-year mark, we may find that loons live even longer than we think they do. But right now, best knowledge, 25 to 30 years of very long-lived species. Secondly, they have delayed onset of breeding. So loons don't mature until they're 3 years old. That's when they're capable of starting to nest. However, as I'm sure many of you know, loons are territorial birds and they need that territory to nest. And our banding data suggests that loons generally don't get that first territory and their opportunity to nest until they're on average about 6 or 7 years old. We've even found some loons that haven't nested for the first time until they're 11. So it takes a lot to get a loon from an egg to a nesting breeding adult. And once you have them there, you need to keep them there. And the third thing is once loons do start nesting, they have a very low rate of chick production. On average, a pair of loons has one surviving chick every 2 years. So you combine all of these things, and what this adds up to is that adult survival is key to a viable loon population. You need to keep these adults alive. That's what's going to keep the population going. Just to put this in graphic form, looking at things that affect the population growth rate of loons, you can see in the red bar here, adult survival is king. You know, obviously we don't want to lose a chick. We don't want to lose a juvenile. It hurts the population. But from a population standpoint, losing an adult is so much worse. So when you combine this graph with this graph showing that 42% of the adult loons that we've collected have died as a result of ingesting lead fishing tackle. And of course, keeping in mind that lead tackle targets the adult loons, you end up with this. Of all the factors that we are able to quantify that negatively impact the loon population, lead fishing tackle is by far the worst and more than the rest of these combined. So what if all of these loons that died of lead fishing tackle had survived? In other words, what is the population level impact of all these lead deaths on New Hampshire's loons? I'm going to put up a graph here that's going to look a little bit scary, but don't worry, it's not nearly as bad as it looks. So these two dashed lines that you see here, this is what we estimate, somewhere in here is what we estimate New Hampshire could support as far as a loon population. The habitat is suitable for between roughly 1,100 and a little bit over 1,400 loons. So this is where the population should be. Now these blue dots down here, this is our observed population. So this is the number of loons Loon Preservation Committee is counting in New Hampshire every year. So when we send our field biologists out throughout the state in the summer to monitor the loon population, keep track of nesting, and count the loons, when we have reports from our wonderful volunteers of what they're seeing on their lake as far as loons. And of course, we have our loon census in the summer. We put all that data together at the end of the summer and we come up with a number. And that's what this blue dot is representing. It's the number of loons LPC has counted every year. Now, the blue and the red line is where we anticipate the loon population could be if the loons that had died as a result of lead poisoning had actually survived. So basically what we did is we put together a model to look at exactly that question, where would the loon population be? And this is what the results were. We basically plugged the loons that died of lead back into the population, let them go and lead a normal life, essentially, have the chicks that they would have had, and this is the result. So we estimate the loon population could have been somewhere between this green line and this red line. The green line is probably conservative because the green is representing simply the adult loons that we actually collected that died of lead. But we don't think we're finding all of the loons that die throughout New Hampshire in the course of a year. And that's what the red line is. The red line is our estimate at how many loons actually died from lead. So the actual number is probably a lot closer to this red line than the green line. So what's this saying? We ended this study in 2012. In 2012, LPC had counted 638 adult loons in New Hampshire. We estimate the population, if those loons had not died of lead over the years, could be about 43% higher. You can see it's right up here, just a little bit north of 900. That 900 would have gotten us a lot closer to where New Hampshire should be. And it's representing the fact that there are a lot of lakes that should be echoing to the calls of the loons out there, and they aren't yet. And so lead, basically what we're able to show with this model is that lead has been the literal weight holding down the recovery of loons in New Hampshire. Of course, Loon Preservation Committee has been working since 1975 to recover this loon population. We've been working with volunteers to bring these loons back. And had it not been for the lead, that population, that recovery could have been a lot stronger. It really shows just what a terrible impact lead has had on the loon population and how much it has hindered the recovery of loons. And so as Caroline mentioned, we published this paper in the Journal of Wildlife Management. And this was the first paper documenting a population level effect on loons from lead fishing tackle. So it was really, really great to get that out in the scientific literature. But obviously, Loon Preservation Committee wanted to do something about this. And so we took our data to the state legislature, and that data was able to inform first in the nation legislation to restrict certain sizes and types of lead fishing tackle to protect New Hampshire's loons. So in 2000, the initial legislation took effect, and that restricted the use of sinkers that weighed 1 ounce or less and jigs less than 1 inch in total length, including the hook. They restricted the use of those tackles in lakes and ponds in New Hampshire. In 2005, it expanded to all freshwater. And in 2006, the ban went into effect on the sale of these sizes and types of tackle as well. And the 1 ounce sinker standard is a really good standard. It's very protective of the loons. It's not that often that we find loons with something larger inside of them. We do, but it's not that common. So that's a great standard. Now the jig standard, less than 1 inch in total length, including the hook, that's a really tiny jig. So this was going to be a problem for us. And if you take a look at what we've removed from the loons, so here's what was following that legislation, the size of jig that was covered by the law. And what these blue bars represent is the length of the jigs that we've removed from loons over the years. So basically not a single loon was protected by that jig standard. But obviously it was all that could get through the legislature at the time. And when you look at what these loons are ingesting, the majority of what they're ingesting is jigs. So the fact that the jig standard that was in place as of 2000 was not protective of the loons was problematic. So as we continued to see these loons dying of lead poisoning, and in many cases, ingesting jigs. We knew we had to do something. We took our data back to the state legislature. And in 2013, our data informed legislation that closed that jig loophole. And then Governor Maggie Hassan came to the Loon Center, signed the bill that closed that loophole, and that was a great day for loons. There was a 3-year phase-in period for it, so this law took effect in 2016. So right now, the law in New Hampshire is jigs and sinkers, 1 ounce or less, are restricted for sale and use in freshwater. And this is a very good standard. It's protective of a large portion of the lead that the loons are ingesting. And right now, we currently have the most protective lead law in the country for loons and other wildlife. But now, of course, the challenge is to make sure that people are not using lead and that this law is being complied with. And so Loon Preservation Committee, in 2018, we launched our lead tackle buyback program, which is a really fantastic program. It's been very successful so far. And so what the program is that if anglers bring in 1 ounce of illegal tackle to a participating tackle shop, in return, they're given a $10 voucher to get whatever they want in that tackle shop. And it's really been fantastic. We're still tabulating the results from this past year, but in the first 2 years of 2018 and 2019, so far we have collected over 17,000 pieces of lead, and every one of those pieces of lead had the potential to kill a loon or some other species of wildlife. So that's all of those pieces have been removed as a potential threat to loons. And this program's also been wonderful in just helping us to keep the word out about lead tackle, as well as building bridges with the angling community, tackle retailers. It's been a fantastic program. And you can find out more about it and which tackle shops are participating at the website loonsafe.org, where you can learn all about it. But I'll be very eager to see what our results are from this summer as we continue to bring in that tackle and help protect the loons. And of course, the fact of the matter is this is an entirely avoidable and preventable cause of death for loons. You do not need to fish with lead. We always like to say LPC is not anti-fishing. All we are is anti-lead. So go out, get yourselves this non-lead tackle. It's available tin, bismuth, steel, tungsten, even stone. These are all effective. They're affordable. Tungsten is apparently being used by a lot of the professional anglers right now because it's denser than lead, and they can feel the action of it as it's moving through the water better, and that apparently allows them to catch more fish. So you can catch just as good a fish with these non-lead tackle alternatives. And so just a reminder to everybody, if you've got an old tackle box that's been collecting dust in the back garage or the boathouse for who knows how many years, that tackle box is going to be full of lead. So make sure you clean out those old tackle boxes, treat yourself to a shopping spree at your local tackle shop, load up on the non-lead tackle, and fill that tackle box with it. It's one of the biggest things that you can do to help protect New Hampshire's loon population. And make sure you spread the word to all of your friends as well. So it's too early to say exactly what the effect of the legislation, the lead tackle buyback program, as well as all of our efforts to make people aware of this issue, but the trends are encouraging. So this graph is showing the population rate over the years of lead mortality with our loons. Here in the year 2000, we've got the initial ban on lead going into place. Here, 2006 is the sale ban, and then the closing of the jig loophole that took effect in 2016. And you see that this trend line is going in the right direction. As I say, it's too early to really say and run this proper statistics on it, but it's looking good. But of course, we need to get this down to zero here and make sure that no more loons have to die of lead. And of course, it's not just loons. All 28 of these species on this slide have been documented to have ingested lead fishing tackle. And EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, estimates that at least 74 species of birds in North America are at risk of lead ingestion due to their feeding behaviors. So once again, as in so many other things, loons are a sentinel of environmental quality. Loons are that indicator species of the health of the aquatic ecosystem, and that certainly goes for lead poisoning as well. So we still have a long ways to go, and Loon Preservation Committee is working very hard to ensure that this is no longer the picture that we need to see. Another wonderful loon lost to lead poisoning, this one from Squam Lake at the Yard Islands. We are working to go from this picture to this picture. Loons living their lives, raising their young, doing exactly what they should be doing. And we have accomplished so much together. The lead legislation would not have been possible without an outpouring of support from the people of New Hampshire who care about loons and other wildlife. And now we're working to bring it home and eliminate this completely preventable and avoidable cause of death for loons in New Hampshire, and to make sure that these little chicks just continue peeping out from underneath their parents' feathers well into the future. And together, we can all work together to ensure a very bright future for loons in New Hampshire. So thank you all very much for tuning in this evening. I just want to give a shout out to the folks who contributed the beautiful pictures that we saw in this presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, so everyone feel free to continue putting your questions in the chat. We do have a couple that came in, Tiffany, that some of them I answered, but I want to make sure that people who aren't paying attention to the chat also get those answers. So the first one has to do with the mortality graph, the pie chart. And could you just explain those 56 unknown mortalities and what that means?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So that could mean any number of things. It could be a case where a loon came in and it was so badly decomposed. There are times where you get those loons that, perhaps died like at the end of the previous season. They're not found until perhaps the following spring. And all they are pretty much at that point is feathers and bones. And we do take a look at those because actually the gizzard oftentimes is one of the few internal organs that is left. And so even when we have what appears to be simply feathers and bones, we'll x-ray those loons and see, because we have found lead poisoned loons. The x-ray has shown us lead in some of those gizzards, but in other times, it's not feathers and bones. The loons may not have died of lead poisoning. It may have been something else. And you simply can't really tell what killed them. In other cases, you may get a mortality that's in good condition, and you do the necropsy on it, and there is just nothing that evidently jumps out. I've actually heard people say who have necropsied a loon after, basically getting a perfectly fresh dead body, that as far as they can tell, that loon should still be swimming around out there. It can be difficult. And actually this, one of the things that the Loon Preservation Committee, along with our partners, have been working towards more in recent years is to make sure that when we have carcasses that are very fresh, that we get them to the UNH veterinary diagnostic lab in order to do histopathology on these loons. And this may well cover some of those unknown cases that you saw in that pie chart before that was really happening. So right now, actually, one of Dr. Pokers's students, Dr. Inga Sidor, is a pathologist. She's at the veterinary diagnostic lab, and she actually was a Tufts intern at Loon Preservation Committee a number of years ago. She's now gone on to be a wildlife pathologist. And it's great to have a loon person in pathology at the veterinary diagnostic lab. And so Now we are getting her tissue samples that she can do the histopathology on to look for things that may have been missed in the past. And so some of the cases of avian malaria that we've seen in recent years, would those have been detected in some of the previous necropsies? Maybe, maybe not, but we're starting to look more for some of these microscopic level things that may contribute to a loon's death that, back in the 80s and early 90s, people weren't necessarily looking at those. So, sometimes you have a loon that dies and it's just not evident what could have killed it. Sometimes the carcass condition is just too poor to determine. And sometimes some of those may simply be older cases when histopathology that might have been able to tell us what killed that loon just wasn't being done, and it wasn't evident what killed those loons.
And then there's a question about the lead legislation and sort of the gradual progression of that. And the question is, was that a planned strategy to gradually tighten it, or, what's the explanation behind that?
Yeah, I could only wish it was a planned strategy, but it wasn't. So it was, in each case, it was a matter of what was able to pass the legislature at that time. So, it would have been nice to have gotten everything in place in a chunk, the perfect legislation from the beginning. But, as they always say, politics is like making sausage, right? And it's pretty much a matter of what's able to pass a given legislature at a given time. And so it's been trying to close some of those loopholes along the way. And the institution of the sale ban in 2006 was really important, just because, once people are no longer able to purchase the tackle, as they work themselves through their tackle stock, and they're forced to go to a store and buy more tackle, if only non-lead tackle is available, that will help get out of the system, because enforcement is difficult. And there's not really the resources to enforce it, which is done by the conservation officers of New Hampshire Fish and Game, but obviously they have very limited funding and capacity. So that sale ban is really important. It was important to get that for the jigs as well during the latest round of legislation. But yeah, it would have been wonderful to have gotten the perfect legislation from the beginning. But as I say, it's a question of politics and what you can make it through the legislature at any given moment.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it sort of goes back to something that folks were talking about at the very beginning, which is that there are some states where it's totally legal to use lead, and there's just different protective standards around those states, unfortunately. But it was a slow process in New Hampshire, so I would say to you guys, don't give up hope. And if you're interested in supporting that sort of legislation, get in touch with the folks that are working on it in your state and see how you can help out. There's sort of a follow-up question on the unknown deaths. So those 56 loons, could some of those have been just from old age or a natural death?
Yeah, so, and it's funny because the natural death is an interesting point, as far as loons dying of old age. Some of those, like, for example, when I've heard somebody who's done a necropsy who said, like, oh man, as far as they can tell, that loon should still be out there swimming. Is that old age? Because of course at this time we are not once a loon reaches its adult plumage at 2.5, 3 years of age, we're not able to tell how old that loon is. At this time there is no way to age a loon once it's past that 3-year mark. So it is entirely possible that you had a 30-plus-year-old loon that just had reached the end of its life, had essentially died from old age. It's possible. We just don't have a way to really tell that at this time.
Great. Well, that's all of the questions I'm seeing in chat. So I guess this is just a good time to say thank you again to everyone who attended. There are a lot of comments in the chat about, you shouldn't be using lead and support for restrictions on the use of lead. So, thank you all again for being supportive of that. It's great to see.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for your attention, and don't forget to tell all of your friends and angling neighbors and lake neighbors, if you're on a lake, to get that lead out, choose the non-lead tackle, and they can still catch a lot of great fish and enjoy the loons.
Oh, and we have one one last question that just popped in, with someone being surprised that there's not a way to age loons past 3. So the question is there research being done to find a way?
Yeah, so people are working on these questions of aging wildlife species, and it's certainly been discussed with loons. I'm not aware of any specifically active, or I should say loon-specific active research projects on that going on right now, although it's certainly something that we've talked about among our colleagues about the possibilities of that. But I think there's some research being done in some other bird species on that, but just not there yet.
All right. So sorry for that false end, but glad to get that last question in. Thanks again, everyone, for